Thank you so much for coming. I'm very heartened by all the new recruits to the Naval ROTC. PT will begin promptly at 5 a.m. tomorrow. I'm really excited for this panel, and I thought I was going to have to do those introductions, but now having that out of the way, I really want to go ahead and introduce a couple of themes that I hope might help tie all of this together. One of those is the long shadow of the late 19th century and its continuing influence on America today, and I feel like we'll touch on that in a number of different ways. And the other is this desire by us historians and journalists over the years to control the narrative about what we think about the past. And so we're a controlling lot up here, and I thought I would jump right into that. And so, Charles, why Garfield?
Yeah, that's the question that I've had to answer 900 times since beginning the writing of this book 4 years ago. Howell and I, we have the same challenge, which is we have written about relatively unknown parts of America's past. James Garfield was described even before he ran for the presidency as one of the most accomplished and influential Americans of all time. Rutherford Hayes, who's another one of those delightfully forgotten late 19th century presidents, described James Garfield. He said of Garfield, "The truth is no man ever started so low who accomplished so much in all of our history, not even Abraham Lincoln or Benjamin Franklin." Garfield was the last president born in a log cabin. He was raised by a single mother. He wasn't even the first James Garfield in his family. He was named after his dead older brother. So, tough way to start your life. But then you fast forward to his late career, and this is even before he's president. He is minority leader of the House of Representatives. He'd been in the House for 9 consecutive terms, which was almost a record breaker. He practiced law in front of the Supreme Court. He had been this prolific writer, writing these wonderful columns in the Atlantic and the North American Review. He'd been a decorated general during the Civil War, and there's connective tissue again between that story and the story Howell told. And he'd also written an original proof of the Pythagorean theorem in his free time. So he was an American Renaissance man even before his administration. And then he was assassinated at the very top of his political career. So it was just a remarkable arc of a life that I think has generally been eclipsed by how it ended rather than what that life was about. So that's what drew me in, really. And it was just a fantastic journey to write about that wonderful American life.
Not only argued a case before the Supreme Court, but his first court case.
Yeah, his first case. His first case was in front of the Supreme Court. Yeah, right. So, it's hard to fit that all in.
I mean, that's a great icebreaker, I think.
It was.
Howell, your book is a very personal book.
Yes, it is. And back to the point of narrative. Control of narrative is the essence of the Civil War story. History is not what happened, it's what gets written down. And what gets written down is controlled by the holders of political power and the people who control the majority culture. And that's exactly what happened with the emergence of the lost cause narrative, taking over not only the first 6 decades of 20th century history writing in American universities, but also over in the popular mind through Gone with the Wind and the other things we could name, influencing the way the war is remembered as a romantic narrative featuring prominently mistreated Southern aristocrats. So I grew up in Alabama in a mountain family in North Alabama, which is the anti-Confederate part of Alabama, in a household that was free of Confederate nostalgia. Neither in my parents' home nor in the homes of my extended family did I ever see a picture of Robert E. Lee or Jefferson Davis. This led to what became a lifelong quest and to reconnect, to reinvent, to discover through genealogy my relatives who refused to support the Confederacy in Alabama but went north and enlisted in the Union Army. One of the least known facts of Civil War history is that there were 100,000 residents of the 11 Confederate states who volunteered for the Union Army. They made up 5% of the Union Army, yet their history was never explored scholastically until Richard Nelson Current's book, Lincoln's Loyalists, published in 1992. Since then, a new generation of scholars have dug into these stories, and that's what I was working on as I have discovered my Union heritage. And then the second narrative has to do with exactly what these 2,065 members of the 1st Alabama U.S. Cavalry did in helping Sherman burn Atlanta. And the third element of my narrative has to do with how lost cause historians disappeared them from the mainstream of American history.
Great, thank you. Where your books overlap the most, of course, mostly because of Garfield's timely death, or untimely death, I should say. It depends on how you view it, right?
Right.
These decades right after the American Civil War, where there's quite a lot in flux. I mean, when I teach this time period, I try to emphasize to my students just how turbulent this period is. There's a lot going on in terms of technology. There's a lot going on in terms of human movement. One of the points I bring up is that in a period of 36 years, you have 3 presidents assassinated, which is like, talking about having 3 assassinations since the mid-1990s.
Right.
And then you think about the turmoil. And so we see, Howell, in your book, you spend a lot of time talking about the originator, perhaps, of the term lost cause, Edward Pollard, who writes a book by that name, several books that involve that name, and then our good friend at Columbia University, William Archibald Dunning, and the construction of this lost cause narrative. And I want to go to Charles on this as well, in the context of Garfield. How much of this was controlling of the narrative, and how much of it was a nation ready to hear it?
That's a splendid question, and I think, as with most questions of that sort, it has a complicated answer. One, Edward Pollard was a fascinating guy. He was a Richmond newspaper man who hated Jefferson Davis. In 1865, he published the book, The Lost Cause, which is this thick. He published it a year after the war ended, or maybe 1866. It established Jefferson Davis's reputation as a military bumbler. Coming on the heels of Pollard, Jubal Early, the former Confederate general, takes the Lost Cause title and attaches it to a movement to make a national hero of Robert E. Lee, a noble knight without sin or error. He succeeded so tremendously that by the time William Archibald Dunning gets his PhD at Columbia University, he authors a thoroughly pro-Confederate narrative about the Civil War, which depicts the Southern plantation owners as misunderstood aristocrats who were simply trying to do business but had a labor problem. He trained then a generation of scholars who fanned out across the Deep South, including principally to Vanderbilt and the University of Alabama and Sewanee, who established this lost cause narrative of Southern suffering as the central facet of American historiography.
Yeah. The subtitle of your book is Garfield from Radical to Unifier.
Yes.
One of the big historians in this era is, the question of, to quote the historian David Blight, the emancipationist legacy of the Civil War. And I think a number of historians have subsequently debated to the degree how ardent that emancipationist legacy was in the first place. So, but let's talk a little bit about Garfield in this drift.
Yeah, no, he really exemplified the movement of the Republican Party from the state of the Civil War through Reconstruction and into the Gilded Age. James Garfield entered Congress. He had just been a general during the Civil War, and then he decided, actually he wrote from Alabama, of all places.
He did.
Garfield wrote from the field as he was campaigning through Alabama, there will spring out of this war a host of new dangers and new questions, the settlement of which will be of greater importance than finishing the war itself. And he's writing about Reconstruction. And then he continues in that letter, and he's writing back home, and he says, I think I'd be of greater use in settling those questions in Congress than in the Army. And that's his way of asking his friends to elect him to Congress, which is exactly what they do. And he's a radical. He is, for the lack of a better term, he is to the left of Lincoln on all these issues of emancipating the slaves, of extending equal rights to former slaves. But then he's actually described as being as radical a man as ever walked the halls of Congress at that time. Garfield is an iconoclast. And then you fast forward 17 years later, and he is a moderate, relatively elderly leader of the House Republicans. He is minority leader in the House. And so his attitude on all these questions of a thorough reconstruction, those have gone. The political tide has faded, really, on the Reconstruction issue. This is, you were talking earlier about the vagueness of the late 19th century. It's this obscure time where there is no central conflict that we can really point modern scholars and members of the public to, but it's this tremendously tumultuous time of political polarization, of great legal upheaval. You have at least one stolen presidential election in that time frame, the election of 1876. And the North gradually loses interest in fixing the South. To ask Northern voters to have the patience for the thoroughness of that process, that's a lot to ask of average voters in America. And so that's basically essentially what happens. And Garfield, by his presidency, as president-elect, he really embodies this shift. And as a result, his legacy on the issue is very complicated. But he writes in his diary that time and education are going to be the solution of the Southern issue. He's willing to leave the settlement of all of these systemic problems, both of his time and then in many ways preceding it, to, as I write, the solution of all things, the passage of time. And I think as we've gone on as a nation, that's both proven the validity of that perspective and then also its shortcomings in many ways.
And both of you talk about the seeds of the later 19th century during the war itself and the topic of greed and the sort of avarice that's demonstrated by people on both sides of the conflict as the war is going on and accelerating as its outcome becomes increasingly clear. Particularly this issue of stolen cotton.
It's central to this tale of both armies, and it's as Professor and I were discussing earlier, it's a very hard subject to penetrate because the officer corps of both parties were capturing and selling cotton through outlets such as Mobile, New Orleans, the Bermudas, and New York, so that the flow of captured cotton continued constantly from the battlefield. The curious thing is that both Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln looked the other way. They knew it was going on. Grant even tried to drive the Jewish cotton merchants out of Memphis. He was very anti-Semitic, Grant, as well as being a racist, as was Sherman. That's an aside. This flow of money was tremendous, and it's never been fully accounted for, but one anecdote that I like is Colonel George Spencer, a New York-born politician who wound up as the colonel of the 1st Alabama Cavalry USA, at the end of the war had $50,000 worth of captured cotton in a warehouse in Tuscaloosa, which was ostensibly under the control of his Confederate rival, General Roddy from Alabama. The two of them went into business immediately after the war.
And we see Garfield really operating in the midst of all this, but during the war, he's still fairly idealistic.
He is, yes. He always had this, for all of his looseness and his ideological open-mindedness by the end of his political career, there was a thread of morality and consciousness, or conscience, I should say, running through it all. In the war, though, when it comes to the question of morality, he joined the war not just because of his abolitionist principles. He genuinely, from the very beginning of the Civil War, he knew it was going to be a question of slavery versus freedom, which was not a popular viewpoint in the North at the beginning of the conflict. But he entered it also because he saw great political opportunity in the conflict. He was a state-level politician in Ohio, and one of his friends wrote him actually, that we are to be led for the next 2 decades by the men who fight in this war. And that was motivating, that inspired James Garfield to get a commission in the Union Army. And if you look at the track record of those 19th century presidents, that was entirely right. From Ulysses Grant through to Benjamin Harrison, and even William McKinley. They all did their service in the Union Army during the Civil War, and the term for men who joined the Union Army during the Civil War for political reasons, because they wanted to promote themselves, among home constituencies, the term was political general, and that was kind of a slur that was thrown around at the time, but it definitely applies to a lot of the rationale for these men joining that conflict.
There are several moments you recount in your book where McKinley, Garfield, Benjamin Harrison, and Forrest Gump are all together on the same platform.
Yes, that's right. William McKinley was one of Rutherford Hayes's close aides during the war. Garfield was fighting alongside Ulysses Grant at numerous points. They all crossed paths at numerous times. Even Chester Arthur. Chester Arthur was a quartermaster general up in New York City. Not exactly as daring a fighter as those other guys. But yeah, no, they all, the flow of opportunity, they all sensed where it was going in many ways.
Hal, I was really taken with your analysis of a name well known in this town, William Alexander Percy, author of Lanterns on the Levee, and of course, uncle of the novelist Walker Percy.
Right.
And walk us through that, if you
Well,
would.
the Percys are an interesting story, and they are most closely identified with Greenville, Mississippi, the Paris of the Delta, as it called itself, and New Orleans. But they were, in fact, rich because of Birmingham coal and iron. Walker Percy's father was the lawyer for the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company. He engineered the sale of the TCI to U.S. Steel during Teddy Roosevelt's administration in defiance of the antitrust laws. He was so guilt-ridden about selling out to the Yankees from Pittsburgh that he committed suicide across the street from the Birmingham Country Club, where his portrait still hangs. So Walker Percy grew up in Birmingham as the heir to this tremendous New South fortune of industrial money. And one of the minor narratives in my book is how money that the Percys made in Birmingham and on a plantation near Huntsville, Alabama, was the money they used to purchase their plantation at Greenville, Mississippi. So this is not just a plot on my part, or maybe not entirely a part on my part, to reassert the centrality of Alabama to particularly the Unionist story in the Civil War. I'm going to switch now from the pro-Confederate Percy family back to the 1st Alabama Cavalry. These were farmers from North Alabama who elected delegates to the Secession Convention in Montgomery in 1861 and pledged them not to support secession. They so infuriated the Confederates in the legislature, 24 of them refused to sign the Ordinance of Secession. 24 of the 100 delegates in the Alabama Convention refused to sign the Ordinance of Secession. They returned home, and they were immediately pursued by Confederate draft squads, setting off a flood of North Alabama farmer boys from the hill country whose family owned no slaves into Union-occupied Huntsville. And that's where the 2,000 of them enlisted to form the 1st Alabama Cavalry. That's a long way from Percy, but I had to get that plug
No,
in.
I think that's great. And, I oftentimes was thinking about the work of Vicki Bynum, talking about, the Free State of Jones, which then became the Matthew McConaughey vehicle of the same name. But there are these pockets of unionism, and they, as you pointed out earlier in this talk, they're not really emphasized until we get into the 1990s with Current and Bynum and others.
Yes, that's exactly right. Throughout the Appalachians, from Virginia down through North Georgia, East Tennessee, and North Alabama, there was a majority of white people, white voters, which are all male then, who opposed secession. Many of them were actively anti-Confederate, but even the others were disloyal to the idea of destroying the Union. And that's the part of Civil War scholarship that's only come to light in the last few decades. And I say in my book, I stand on the shoulders of this new generation of PhDs who put together the entire story of the 1st Alabama Cavalry, which briefly was this. They so impressed a political general named Grenville Dodge that he told General Sherman to pick them as his escorts, personal escorts on the march to the sea. Sherman brings them into his camp in Chattanooga. They start toward Atlanta. These are Alabama farm boys who, according to Sherman's memoirs, carried his cigars, carried his clean clothes, and carried his whiskey, and built his campfire every night from Chattanooga to Atlanta to Savannah. They so distinguished themselves in the field on the march, particularly between Atlanta and Savannah, that General Blair, intimate of Lincoln, picked them for the place of honor in the 17th Corps Victory Parade through Savannah. So you've got this completely buried fact of Southern history that these several hundred Alabamians, there are about 800 surviving by this point, actually marched with Savannah through the captured city of Savannah. Then you get to the question I try to deal with in the last third of my book: how did they get disappeared from history?
Yeah, and the controlling of the narrative of the lost cause and suppressing. You have a lot to say about the Alabama Department of Archives and History.
Back to our friend William Archibald Dunning, a name well known to every history major in America, I suspect. He was the son of a New Jersey industrialist. His father admired Southern plantation owners as his class peers. These were upper-class, educated men running businesses. He imbued William Archibald Dunning with this pro-Confederate commercial bias. Dunning goes to Columbia, and between 1900 and his death in 1921, he becomes the leading Civil War historian in the nation, and establishing the Dunning School, and training the generation of Southern and national historians who would write the Civil War history as it was told up to 1960 and the birth of the Civil Rights Movement.
And arguably still told some places.
Still told. I think, personally, the Dunning School is the biggest influence on popular conceptions of the Civil War. Since my book came out, I've received letters from people who went to elementary and high school in the upper Midwest in New England who said their takeaway from their public school education about the war was the Gone with the Wind narrative of the suffering South.
Mm-hmm. Charles, does Reconstruction fail in the North? I mean, we know about Reconstruction collapsing in the South for a variety of reasons, this sort of Southern narrative of Reconstruction, but you really tackle the Northern narrative of Reconstruction.
Yes, it really did, and also in general, as you both know quite well, it's hard to really pin, it's not a binary judgment we can really render on Reconstruction. The scale to its failure or success, the truth is it was entirely a mixed bag. But no, it did stutter over time in the North. It was simply not generally a popular cause among the old Republican base after a while. You saw this fracturing of the old Northern War Coalition into all these new, very colorfully named factions over time, none of which were really devoted to the old school Grant style of heavy-handedness, for lack of a better term, with the South. You had one faction was called the Stalwarts because they viewed themselves as real, unrepentant Republicans, and they were really devoted to the spoils system rather than anything else. And then you had the half-breeds, who were their opponents, who were called that because they were seen as being not real Republicans. So history rhymes in certain ways. But really, in the North at least, the explanation that seems to have been settled on was Reconstruction failed as a political cause due to eventually the apathy of the Northern voter. You had economic crises, these dramatic, like the Panic of 1873, these dramatic historical recessions that really undermined the federal government's ability to invest in these policies anymore. And then legally, the Supreme Court was a tremendous obstacle to the thorough prosecution of Reconstruction, and many of the reasons for that actually come right back home to New Orleans, the slaughterhouse cases, for example. So, it did gradually lose that current over time, I'd argue.
Yeah, so one thing when we were on our way over here, we were talking about the shift in the way we think about the Civil War in our own time. And you write about, of course, the Ken Burns replaying of the Ken Burns documentary 25 years later, and it doesn't age so well. And also, I related this story that around 2011, I noticed that fewer students were enrolling in my Civil War class. And I don't think it was me. It may have been me. But students were just less interested. Of course, that would always have a wait list. It was everything. And we think about like Tony Horowitz writing Confederates in the Attic in the 90s, and that was when it was so big. And I had all these friends who teach Civil War history, and they're like, the sesquicentennial is going to be a big deal. And it went off with the biggest whimper ever.
Yeah. Well, I think part of it was because Ken's film did not age well. As John Meacham has said, you couldn't make that film today because it is the upper-class white person's version of the Civil War. And one of the things I found out is that Shelby Foote, the Mississippian, didn't tell Ken or Rick Burns or Jeffrey Ward, their prize-winning historical co-writer, he did not tell them about the 1st Alabama Cavalry. Being a chauvinistic Mississippian, Shelby told them about the Free State of Jones, which became the film that you're aware of. And the Free State of Jones was a pro-Union hotbed in Jones County, Mississippi. Most of their citizens were forced into the Confederate Army. A few opposed the Union in the guerrilla warfare, but they had no effect on the outcome of the war. Whereas the 1st Alabama was there with Sherman every step of the way, and they were part of a force of only 5,000 cavalry, which rode in front of his 60,000 infantry troops, doing the most dangerous duty in the war. So I, in conversations with Ken and his two authors, they both assured me that Shelby Foote had simply not told them about the Alabamians in the Union Army. Why did he keep it back, I wanted to know. Well, then I said, I want to prove whether or not Shelby Foote knew about the 1st Alabama Cavalry. And one of the things that I did in my research was go through every kind of obscure literary book, doctor's dissertation, master's theses, and finally I found an interview that Shelby did in 1969. And his interviewer was a literary student from Hollins College who said, were there any Mississippians in the Union Army? And Foote very enthusiastically says, oh yes, there were some from North Mississippi, but the most of the Southern Unionists were from North Alabama and East Tennessee. And then Foote goes on to name Strait's Raid, an important battle that the 1st Alabama was intimately involved in. So to me, that was the smoking gun that proved Shelby Foote made sure that no one who watched Ken Burns' film would ever hear the 1st Alabama.
You guys are both impugning Ken Burns quite boldly, considering he's here on campus.
I saw Ken last night, and his brother Rick, who confirmed this story to me, attended a book party of mine in New York. So I think I'm on good terms with them. To their credit, they told the truth about Shelby Foote not sharing with them his knowledge of Southern Unionism.
But the Civil War remains for sure. I mean, as you both, it remains the most romanticized period of American history that I think that you can really, the depth of enthusiasm you still have from scholars, from amateur researchers still seems quite bold. I wonder if it's what you're perceiving might be a question of, for lack of a better term, relativism. Newer generations, I'm sure your classes these days are more diverse than, as Howell put it, the traditional white upper-class enthusiasts for the Civil War. Maybe the audience is changing just a little bit more, and that changes the level of connection they feel to the subject matter. That could be part of it.
Yeah, and to bring us full circle, and we'll add with the Ken Burns thing, there's still complacency of home field advantage. But have we changed the narrative? I think about, I remember when there was first talk about monuments coming down, that would have been unimaginable in 1995. And today, in the rapidity which they came back, but it has not been without some backlash. So to what extent has the narrative changed?
Well, I think the thing that no Civil War historian of our generation, I'm a good deal older than these two men, could have anticipated was the Trump revival of the lost cause narrative. Professor Carolyn Janey, who's head of the Civil War Institute at the University of Virginia, has written very tellingly about Trump's intentional revival of the Confederate icons, and seizing the statue issue and the naming of the forts after Confederate generals as part of his strategy of undermining faith in the government. And I think that's the central question we're going to see played out. The boldness with which he pandered to pro-Confederate opinion in the South took my breath away. I say that as someone who started his career in 1964 covering George Wallace. I say that as someone who went to Mississippi with Ronald Reagan in 1980 when he was pandering to Ross Barnett. And Trump has put them in the shade with his manipulation of lost cause symbols and narrative. And so is it working politically? Yes, beyond anything George Wallace ever envisioned.
I think, I don't know if the narratives themselves have changed, but the people listening to them certainly have. I think one way of maybe breaking through a little bit of that, I think if you showed modern audiences, modern college students, the politics of the radical Republicans, for example, that group that Garfield was a part of when he was first in Congress, they would see a lot of connective tissue to today. The radicals, not only were they in favor of immediate abolition and immediate equality of rights, they also wanted to disenfranchise, exile, and execute leading Confederates. That's something that I think would really resound with modern college-age kids. They would say, why didn't we do that? They were also in favor of redistributing Southern property, Southern plantation land. That is an interesting precedent for a lot of the politics you see on campus these days, this stuff that people tag as far left. There is an interesting way that you can recast old events, I think, to make it somewhat relevant to a modern audience without endorsing any of the nuances of those
May I add a
beliefs.
footnote to that? Ken Burns is quoted in my book as saying the Civil War is unlike any other war because it's the only war in which the losers got to write the history. And that remains as true today as it was when Ken made his film or when he gave me that quote for my book. So I think I don't want to dilate too long on the implications of the Trump candidacy, but since we're here in the South, in the most important city in the Confederacy at the time of the war, it's worth looking at the fact that half of our population now believes in what I would call, in this citadel of learning, fact-based politics. And the other half of our people believe in imagination-based politics or conspiracy theory-based politics. That's an entirely new thing in American politics, or at least in my career dating back to 1964.
Well, that is very good timing, and I think we are ready for the Q&A session.
Great.
Do we have a question in the audience?
Yeah, feel free to come to the microphone, I think.
Hey, Peter.
I'll ask a question. Why did the losers get to write the history in the Civil War and not in other wars?
Well, as Professor Nystrom said, part of it had to do with our friend William Archibald Dunning from New Jersey. And I guess it goes to show if you take a good Yankee boy and send him to Princeton where he got kicked out and Columbia where he got his PhD, there's no telling what the outcome is going to be. But it's the other thing I would say, Jubal Early mounted, who's another major figure, he took Pollard's title of The Lost Cause, turned it into the cult of Robert E. Lee, and he carried out what I think is the most massive rehabilitation campaign in the history of American public relations. At the end of the war, Robert E. Lee was in danger of being tried as a traitor. As a result mainly of Jubal Early's work and Dunning's work in early 1900s, when the Hall of Fame of Great Americans was opened in New York City, Robert E. Lee was in there with Jefferson Davis and Thomas Jefferson and George Wallace. Davis didn't make the cut, but Stonewall Jackson did.
And the raising of the monuments, the writing of that history, that didn't happen immediately. It required redemption, redeeming, the fall of the Republican governments of the post-war South back into democratic control. And so the reason the history got written the way it was, the reason those statues went up and those books got published, it was because the losers and the descendants of the losers, for lack of a better term, inherited political control of the former Confederacy. And it comes back to a basic human instinct, which is, the inner resistance to admit fault, or the determination to see historical events in as positive a light as for your own predecessors as possible. Robert E. Lee was very much against the raising of any monuments or statues to him in the aftermath of the war, because he grasped, I believe, the importance of telling the history correctly. But over time, that instinct yielded, and then you have Lee Circle in downtown New Orleans. So
without a statue.
Right now, these days without a statue, because these cycles of perspective come and go with the generations typically.
I will add that plug for one of my favorite books about thinking about the Civil War, two really, George Fredrickson's Inner Civil War, and then Louis Menand wrote this really brilliant book that won the Pulitzer about 25 years ago called The Metaphysical Club. And it talks about how antebellum America goes into the war with all this idealism, and it burns out during the war. And so there isn't the sort of moral energy to carry it forward. I do think the lost cause emerges for a variety of reasons, and I do think that's also a powerful one.
I agree. I think you may have some questioners over here.
Yes, my question is about the persistence of the lost cause today. A couple of years ago, there was a Tom Hanks movie called News of the World, where this kind of broken down Confederate veteran, teams up with a child and is portrayed very sympathetically. And I feel like, to me, that's more lost cause thinking. You wouldn't see in Germany, a broken down Nazi soldier portrayed sympathetically. It's still here.
I agree. It's still, I think, the dominant force in most popular culture thoughts about the Civil War. I didn't see News of the World. I barely made it through World War II with Tom, but anyway, you're right.
We don't really also treat children to enough stories about dysentery, and that was a lost opportunity there.
Charlie, I know that historians are not supposed to be prognosticators, but had Garfield survived the attack and served out a 4 or an 8-year term, how different do you think this whole narrative would be?
That's a good question, and that's maybe the most common question regarding Garfield's legacy that gets thrown around these days. Is had he survived the assassination attempt, what would he have been? His politics had evolved to that point in his life, and indeed the reason he was elected to the presidency in the first place, because he was, as you probably know, an unwilling candidate for office, at least aesthetically speaking. Inside, part of him was curious about being president. But he was elected at that point because he believed that politics in America was the art of the possible by that point. He had been, for lack of a better term, a culture warrior about Reconstruction for much of his congressional career, but by that point in his life, he was very much willing to wait and see how, as he put it again, time and education served as the solution to the Southern problem. As a matter of fact, during his inaugural address, Garfield endorses the idea of universal public education in America, and that was the first time that had been done by a president. So had his administration gone forward, I think you would have seen him invest heavily in a public education system in America, very possibly. What you wouldn't have gotten, also I should add, he gave a lot of very interesting patronage jobs to leading African Americans of the time. He was very creative in how he was trying to use the limited authority he had to, continue to lean ahead on the issue. But he had definitely abandoned the Reconstruction policies of old. But one thing that wouldn't have happened was civil service reform. Because civil service reform, which sounds like a boring subject, but it's actually incredibly compelling, trust me, that happened comprehensively in America because of Garfield's death. So a big part of his legacy, actually, I've read at least one historian who's written, Garfield dead was more useful to government reformers in America than Garfield alive. So, it's interesting. And so he was a lot softer on the specifics of the Southern issue than you'd think.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
I have read that the women of the South had a great influence on the myth of the lost cause and the romanticization of the Confederates. They, helped recover bodies and this Confederate memorials and everything. And I just wondered, if you would comment on that.
I left out an important part of the lost cause narrative in the interest of time. As Jubal Early seizes the Southern History Association as a public relations instrument to promote a pro-Confederate interpretation of history, the LMV, the Ladies Memorial Association, LMAs, I think, start out in Virginia. They spread to Atlanta. They even had chapters in New York City, and they were the energy, as Charlie said, for this great flowering of monuments across the South. So, and in his memoirs, Sherman specifically notes that the women he encountered on the plantations were more vociferous Confederates than the husbands who were away on the battlefield.
And you have the Daughters of the American Revolution, of course, are the original movement, to preserve that chapter of American history. I believe you still have the Daughters of the Confederacy as well, right? So there was this element of seizing that mantle and trying to remake it for the lost cause in some ways.
Absolutely.
And if you've been to a battlefield like the Chickamauga battlefield, which we get close to in both of these books, the monumentation on the battlefield the monuments are by the units themselves, soldiers. They wanted to put the monuments where they fought.
Yeah.
They wanted to remember their fallen comrades in that place. But the women are putting up monuments in town. They're putting up monuments that are very much civic in their sort of impetus, as opposed to these military remembrance monuments. I think about if you go across Britain and you see all the war memorials all over Britain, those again are done more by the units themselves as opposed to the women. So yeah, the women do take a very large role in, and there's a lot of really great scholarship about that.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And interestingly about the Johnny Reb monuments in the Southern County seats, they're next to the courthouse, which is a way of saying to black citizens, okay, the war is over, we lost it, but we control the law. And that's a very important symbolic point.
Absolutely. I think that is our time. Thank you
Thank
so
you all
much.
so much.